The terminal buzzed with routine noise, but nothing felt routine about the moment a silver-haired black grandmother stood frozen at the security checkpoint, her crimson passport trembling in her hand. The officer's grip tightened on her arm as a blonde security supervisor jabbed her finger toward the elderly woman like delivering a sentence. Gasps rippled through the line behind them. No one knew who she was. No one knew what was about to unfold. But everyone could feel it, the air shifting, the accusation hanging heavy, the wrongness of it settling like dust before a storm. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to Evelyn Brooks. The supervisor's voice cut across the terminal like a blade. This passport is fake. Step aside. No hesitation. No verification. Just a verdict delivered in front of 24 strangers. Evelyn's breath stuttered, but she didn't snap back. She'd lived long enough to recognize the tone. Sharp, rehearsed, confident in the power of being believed without proof. The young officer beside her clamped her arm harder, as if she might bolt. She couldn't have run even if she tried. Evelyn's knees wobbled beneath her, not from guilt, but from the humiliation blooming hot across her chest. The supervisor snatched the passport, flipping it open without care, shaking her head before even reading the first line. These people always try something, she muttered under her breath, loud enough for the nearest passengers to hear. A couple in line looked at each other, uncertain. A teenage boy lowered his headphones. A mother whispered, "She doesn't look like a criminal," but the supervisor had already turned her back, signaling for additional officers. Evelyn's hands hovered helplessly in the air, trembling as though the weight of a lifetime of moments like this had settled on her shoulders all at once. The officer barked, "Ma'am, stop resisting." She wasn't resisting. She was remembering. The library door shut in her face in 1963. The diner server pretending not to hear her order. The neighbor, who asked whose house she was cleaning. The more things changed, the more the world found new ways to question her right to stand where she stood. The supervisor raised her voice. "If you don't cooperate, you will be detained." Something cracked inside Evelyn. Not fear, not anger, but a quiet, tired truth. "I'm cooperating," she whispered. "You just don't see me." A hush spread. People leaned in. The supervisor rolled her eyes. "Save it. This passport isn't yours. Tell us who you stole it from." Evelyn flinched. Not from the accusation, but from knowing it wouldn't be the last one today. And then, with a breath that steadied her shaking hands, she reached for her phone. The officer tried to stop her, but she lifted it anyway, pressing one familiar name. "Sweetheart," she whispered, voice quivering but clear. "They've stopped me again." A pause. A voice answered, low, authoritative, unmistakably composed. "Stay exactly where you are," he said. "I'm coming inside." Evelyn closed her eyes. No one at the checkpoint knew. No one suspected. But the man on the other end of the line wasn't just family. He was the United States Ambassador. And he was already on his way. The moment Evelyn lowered her phone, the young officer holding her arm stiffened, unsure whether to intervene or wait for backup. The supervisor, convinced she had full authority in this moment, stepped closer, her heels clicking sharply on the tile, as if each step were an accusation. "Ma'am, you are not allowed to make calls during an active security investigation," she snapped. But the words did not land the way she expected. Evelyn was no longer trembling. Something steadier had settled behind her eyes, something quiet but unmistakably strong. The supervisor lifted the passport again, pinching it between two fingers as if it were contaminated. "There is no way this belongs to you," she said, her voice cold, rehearsed, and loud enough for the crowd to hear. "We will confirm the identity of the real passport holder. If you cooperate, this will go faster." Evelyn kept her gaze forward. The crowd behind the stanchions grew thicker. People leaned over luggage, craned their necks, pulled out their phones, but hesitated to press record. The air changed. It was no longer busy airport noise. It felt like a room waiting for a verdict. The officer by Evelyn's shoulder cleared his throat. "Should we check the system one more time, ma'am? It could be a scanning error." The supervisor shot him a glare sharp enough to cut. I know what I am looking at. This is not an error. Her voice rose even higher, slicing through the terminal. Security breach at checkpoint C. Possible identity fraud. Requesting additional units. The entire line recoiled at the words, identity fraud. Evelyn flinched too. Not because she was guilty, but because that phrase had followed her, in different forms, for decades. A woman behind the barrier whispered, "She looks terrified." Her husband responded quietly, "Because they are treating her like a criminal." The young Czech, an attendant from earlier, appeared at the edge of the scene, clutching the corner of her badge nervously. Her voice wavered as she spoke. "Ma'am, I really did see her passport scan green. The system accepted it." The supervisor whipped around. "I told you once. Do not interfere again." The girl froze, words dying in her throat, but the truth hung in the air like a light someone refused to turn off. The supervisor then turned back to Evelyn with a smooth, mocking calm. "Let me make this simple. Tell me where you got this passport. Tell me which relative you borrowed it from, or which lost and found bin you dug it out of." Evelyn's lips parted slightly in disbelief. She had been insulted before, disregarded before, dismissed before, but there was something particularly sharp about being called a thief at 74, while her hands shook from humiliation, not deception. The supervisor took Evelyn's silence as defiance. "You people always try to play innocent. It does not work here. This is a federal checkpoint, not a charity line." The officer beside Evelyn shifted uncomfortably. His grip loosened. The words, "you people," echoed across the terminal loud enough for several passengers to exchange stunned glances. A man in a denim jacket spoke under his breath. "That crossed a line." A woman in a business suit whispered, "She cannot say that. Not here." But the supervisor was not done. She stepped even closer, invading Evelyn's space. "If you refuse to explain how you obtained this document, I will personally escort you to a holding room, and you will wait there for as long as it takes. Do you understand?" Evelyn lifted her eyes slowly. She did not raise her voice. She did not argue. She simply said, "I told someone where I am. He is coming." The supervisor smirked. "Good. He can watch you get processed." The young officer swallowed hard. "Ma'am, what if she is telling the truth?" The supervisor scoffed. "The truth? Look at her. She is shaking. She cannot answer a single question." Evelyn exhaled shakily. "I am shaking," she said softly, "because I have lived long enough to know when someone has already decided what I am." The line fell silent. Even the airport announcements seemed to dim. For a brief moment, no one moved. Then the supervisor leaned in, her tone dripping with false pity. "Do not worry. This will all be over soon." Evelyn closed her eyes, hearing footsteps approaching in the distance, steady, purposeful, growing louder by the second. Help was coming, not because she begged for it, but because someone who loved her knew exactly what it felt like to be judged before being seen. And he was not going to let it happen again. The footsteps grew louder, cutting through the murmur of the terminal until even the supervisor paused mid-sentence. She glanced over her shoulder, expecting the additional security units she had requested, but the rhythm of the steps was different. They were purposeful, synchronized, and carried an authority that did not match airport staff. Evelyn stood very still. She knew that walk. She had heard it behind podiums, on embassy floors, in the quiet halls of government buildings where her son learned to command a room without ever raising his voice. The supervisor turned fully now, irritation forming on her face as a group of suited individuals approached the checkpoint. Passengers instinctively stepped aside. The energy shifted. Something important was moving through the space. At the center of the group was Ambassador Richard Hale, tall, composed, with an expression carved from steel. He was not rushing, but every step announced urgency. The supervisor straightened her uniform, assuming he was a diplomat simply cutting through the wrong lane. She raised her hand dismissively. "Sir, this area is restricted at the moment. Please reroute to another checkpoint." Richard did not acknowledge her. His eyes were fixed on one person only. "Mom." The single word sliced the air open. A stunned gasp rolled through the crowd. The officer holding Evelyn immediately dropped his grip as if burned. Evelyn's breath hitched as her son stepped forward and placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. The supervisor blinked in confusion, then disbelief, then fear. I am sorry, sir. Is this your mother?" Richard turned to her slowly, and the look he gave her was the kind that required no raised voice to be devastating. You detained a 74-year-old woman, accused her of passport fraud, and physically restrained her without verifying a single piece of information. The supervisor opened her mouth, but nothing emerged. Richard continued, voice calm, but carrying the weight of authority that filled the entire concourse. I would like to see the system logs. Now. The officer beside the supervisor fumbled with his tablet, hands shaking as he pulled up the scan records. Richard did not need to lean in. The display was visible enough. According to this, he said, tapping the screen lightly, her passport was scanned and cleared at 8:52 a.m. No flags. No errors. No inconsistencies. The officer swallowed. Yes, sir. That appears correct. Richard inhaled slowly, controlling the storm behind his eyes. Then explain to me why my mother was accused of theft. The supervisor's face drained of color. Sir, these situations are complicated. We were trying to protect the terminal. Sometimes people attempt to use documents that are not. Do not finish that sentence, Richard said sharply, though his volume never rose. The only threat here is the prejudice you projected onto a woman who complied with every instruction you gave her. A murmur swept through the onlookers. The young check-in attendant stepped forward again, her voice trembling but determined. Sir, I tried to tell them. I saw the green scan. I told them she was cleared. Richard nodded once. Thank you. Your integrity is noted. The supervisor's lips quivered. Ambassador Hale, had I known. Richard cut her off instantly. That is exactly the problem. You did not need to know who she was to treat her with basic respect. The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Behind them, 2 airport administrators arrived, drawn by the ambassadorial presence and the palpable tension. One of them stepped closer. Ambassador Hale, we were not informed of any issue. Please allow us to address this immediately. Richard looked at his mother first. Are you hurt? Evelyn shook her head slightly, though her voice was small. Just tired. He nodded, then faced the administrators. My mother will not be questioned further. She will not be searched again, and she will not be spoken to by anyone who participated in this incident. The administrators nodded rapidly. Of course, sir. Absolutely. The supervisor took an involuntary step backward, as if the truth of the moment had just pierced through her authority. Her badge seemed suddenly heavy on her chest. Richard's voice lowered, controlled but edged with fire. You dragged an innocent woman across a checkpoint because you assumed someone like her could not possibly own what you were holding. You turned inconvenience into suspicion, and suspicion into accusation. Evelyn closed her eyes. She had heard those escalations her entire life. But this time, someone else was naming them for her. Someone the room could not ignore. And for the first time since the encounter began, the supervisor seemed to understand the magnitude of what she had done. But the consequences, as everyone in the terminal was about to witness, had only just begun. The crowd had gone silent, but in the space between breaths, something shifted. Attention no longer aimed at Evelyn, but at the woman who had spent the last 10 minutes tearing her dignity apart. The supervisor's confidence drained like water through a sieve as Ambassador Hale stepped closer, his presence turning the checkpoint into something that felt less like airport security and more like a courtroom awaiting a verdict. The administrators hovered behind him, uneasy and wide-eyed, unsure whether to speak or to vanish. The young officer who had restrained Evelyn earlier swallowed hard and stepped slightly away from her, guilt rising in his expression. Richard looked directly at him. Did you put your hands on her? His voice was steady, calm, the kind of calm that carried consequence. The officer hesitated. Sir, I was following instructions. Richard held his gaze without blinking. Following instructions is not a shield when the order itself is rooted in bias. The officer's jaw tightened, shame creeping into his posture, his hand curling at his side, as if trying to pull back the memory of touching her arm. Before he could answer, the supervisor interjected, her voice cracking. Ambassador Hale, with all due respect, the situation escalated quickly. We believed your mother was attempting to bypass security protocols. Her behavior seemed suspicious. Richard turned slowly toward her. Suspicious, he repeated, letting the word hang heavy and unchallenged. Explain to me exactly which behavior signaled criminal intent. Was it her age? Her quietness? Her trembling hands after you berated her? The supervisor flinched. She refused to answer my questions. Evelyn looked up, her voice barely above a whisper. You never asked me any. Several passengers gasped. The truth of it settled instantly. The supervisor's lips parted, but no defense came. The young check-in attendant, emboldened now, stepped fully into the circle of authority. I tried to tell you she was cleared. You dismissed me. You dismissed the scan. You dismissed all of it. Her voice shook, but she held her ground. You said that people like her always try something. The crowd murmured, and someone in the back said loudly, "We heard that." Richard inhaled through his nose, steadying the fire rising in him. "There it is," he said softly. "The words you thought would stay contained between a badge and a powerless traveler." The supervisor shook her head rapidly. "Sir, this is being taken out of context. We handle dozens of cases a day. Sometimes mistakes happen." Richard stepped forward until he stood directly in front of her. Accusing someone of identity fraud is not a minor clerical mistake. Dragging an elderly woman across a federal checkpoint is not a misunderstanding. And reducing her to a stereotype you have clearly rehearsed is not a training issue. It is a bias issue. The administrators exchanged glances, recognizing the gravity of the moment. One of them opened a tablet and began tapping rapidly, pulling up personnel files, scanning procedures, timestamps. Richard watched them, but did not pause his dismantling of the moment. "Show me the footage," he said. The administrator hesitated. "Ambassador, footage is typically restricted from immediate review unless an official claim is filed." "Consider this one," Richard replied. The administrator nodded, accessing the checkpoint recording. The screen played the events back in real time. The supervisor grabbing the passport without reason. The officer restraining Evelyn without resistance. The supervisor shouting accusations that had nothing to do with protocol. The young attendant attempting twice to intervene. And Evelyn, small and trembling, trying to speak, but being spoken over every time. When the footage reached the moment the supervisor said, "You people always try something," several passengers shook their heads. A woman whispered, "That is exactly what she said." Another man crossed his arms. Unbelievable. The supervisor backed away as if trying to separate herself from her own recorded voice. Richard did not raise his volume. He did not need to. "Your actions are now documented, witnessed, and preserved. You crossed a line with my mother. But more importantly, you crossed a line with every person who has ever walked through this checkpoint trusting that your job was to protect them, not profile them." Evelyn stood quietly, watching her son not with pride, but with something gentler, a recognition of a child who had once learned courage from her and had grown into a man capable of returning it when she needed it most. The administrator cleared his throat. "Ambassador Hale, we can confirm that the supervisor's conduct violates multiple federal security guidelines. A report is being filed immediately." Richard nodded once, then looked back at the supervisor, who now seemed smaller than she had minutes earlier. "This is only the beginning," he said, and everyone felt it. The collapse was coming. The checkpoint felt smaller now, as if the walls themselves had leaned in to witness what happened next. The supervisor stood frozen, her confidence drained, her badge suddenly looking less like authority and more like evidence. The administrator holding the tablet cleared his throat again, but his voice was tighter this time. "Ambassador Hale, the report is being filed with immediate priority. We have logged her conduct, her language, and the mishandling of your mother's documents." He hesitated before continuing. "We have also captured the moment Officer Daniels restrained Mrs. Brooks without lawful grounds." The young officer bowed his head, shame carving lines into his face. Richard looked at him, not with rage, but with a sharp truth the young man would carry for the rest of his career. When you act on someone else's bias, you make it your own. Officer Daniels swallowed hard, his face coloring. "Sir, I should have questioned the order. I should have checked the system myself." The supervisor finally snapped out of her stunned haze. "This is absurd. I was doing my job." She acted suspiciously. She refused to answer. Richard's voice cut through hers like a razor through silk. She tried to speak. "You interrupted her." She complied. "You escalated." She stood still. "You grabbed her." He took one step closer. "And the entire time, you never once looked at her as a person." The supervisor clenched her jaw, hands trembling. "I made a judgment call." Evelyn lifted her chin, strength blooming beneath the exhaustion. "No," she said softly. "You made an assumption." The quiet conviction in her voice rippled through the checkpoint. A woman from the crowd stepped forward slightly, clutching her purse. I saw everything, she said. She did nothing wrong. Nothing. A man in a business jacket added. You treated her like she did not belong here. Like she had no right to stand in this line. More voices followed, hesitant at first, then gathering momentum. She was scared. You ignored the scan. I heard you belittle her. The supervisor's breathing quickened as the weight of her own actions circled around her. It no longer came from just an ambassador. It came from an entire terminal of witnesses who had seen the truth unfold. The administrator tightened his grip on the tablet. Per protocol, we must suspend the supervisor pending full investigation. She will need to surrender her badge and step away from the checkpoint immediately. The supervisor's eyes widened. What? You cannot suspend me in front of all these people. Richard replied. That is exactly where accountability belongs. The administrator extended his hand. Slowly, with the reluctance of someone watching their authority crumble grain by grain, the supervisor unclipped her badge. Her fingers shook as she placed it into his palm. The young Czech in attendant exhaled quietly, as if releasing a breath she had been holding since the moment the passport was confiscated. Richard turned to her. What is your name? She startled. Maya, sir. Maya Collins. Maya, Richard said. Thank you for trying to do the right thing when it mattered. Her eyes glistened with relief. Behind her, the officer who had stood by silently began shifting uncomfortably, the conflict visible on his face. He stepped forward at last. Ambassador, there is something else. The administrator looked up sharply. Officer, anything you disclose now becomes part of the record. Officer Daniels nodded, then spoke carefully. Before you arrived, the supervisor instructed us to treat the passenger as a high-risk individual regardless of what the system scan showed. She said, and I quote, people like her do not belong in priority lanes. She told us to escalate, even if she cooperated. Gasps broke out among the passengers. Maya covered her mouth. The administrator typed rapidly, his expression darkening. Is that accurate? Yes, the officer said. She has said similar things. Before. The supervisor spun toward him, betrayal twisting across her features. You are lying. No, he said quietly. I am finally telling the truth. Richard let the silence settle. Powerful, heavy, necessary. Then he looked at his mother, her hand still trembling slightly. You should never have faced this, he said. Evelyn touched his wrist. You cannot protect me from every ignorance, she whispered. But you can make sure it does not stay hidden. Richard nodded once. Then, that is exactly what will happen. And as the suspended supervisor stood pale and cornered, and the line of passengers watched justice form in real time, it became clear that this moment was no longer just about a passport. It was about every woman who had been dismissed, every elder who had been disrespected, every traveler who had been judged before they were seen. And for the first time that morning, the collapse had truly begun. For several long seconds, no one at the checkpoint moved. The suspended supervisor stood rigid and pale, clutching her empty hands as if the missing badge had taken the last piece of her authority with it. Officer Daniels stared at the floor, the truth he finally admitted still hanging in the air like a bell that could not be unrung. Maya Collins stood near the stanchions, her breath shallow, her courage still trembling, but her eyes refusing to look away from the scene unfolding. Ambassador Hale let the moment settle before he spoke again. His tone was calm, but it carried the same controlled force that had turned entire diplomatic rooms silent. Administrator, I want the full escalation protocol initiated. That includes retrieval of every communication between this team during the last 30 minutes, every timestamp, every audio clip captured by internal microphones, and every scan log related to my mother's passport. The administrator nodded rapidly, typing so quickly the edges of the tablet vibrated in his hands. Yes, Ambassador. I am initiating the request. These logs will be sent to the Federal Oversight Team within the hour. Richard continued. And I want a full audit of all complaints filed against the suspended supervisor and any officer she supervised. If there is a pattern, it will come to light. The supervisor shook her head desperately. You cannot do that without due process. Richard looked at her with an expression colder than anger. Due process is exactly what you denied my mother. The crowd murmured, a low swell of agreement. Evelyn closed her eyes briefly, letting out a breath she had held since the moment her passport was seized. She had learned to endure moments like this. She had learned to absorb the sting quietly, because life had taught her there was rarely anyone to stand with her. But today, someone was standing. Someone the room could not ignore. The administrator hesitated, then said, "Ambassador, there is another matter. While reviewing the logs, we found that the passport verification request was manually overridden by the supervisor before the system could complete its cross-reference." Richard turned sharply. "She overrode the system?" "Yes, sir. The system was attempting to authenticate the chip. The override blocked the verification and forced a review-required flag. That is why the officer reacted as he did." Maya gasped softly. "She created the problem." The supervisor's voice cracked. "I did not override anything intentionally. It must have been a malfunction." The administrator shook his head. "The logs show your user identification code. There is no malfunction." The crowd reacted with outrage now, no longer whispering but openly condemning. "She set her up. She manufactured suspicion. Firing is not enough for this." Officer Daniel stepped closer, his voice subdued. "Ambassador Hale, may I speak plainly?" Richard nodded. "Go ahead. The reason she told us to treat your mother as high risk is because this is not the first time she has done this. She has a habit of flagging elderly travelers of color as suspicious even when nothing triggers it in the system." The supervisor spun toward him again. "Stop lying. You are throwing your career away." "No," he said, voice firming for the first time. "I am admitting what I should have confronted months ago." Maya lifted her chin. "He is telling the truth. I have seen her do the same to a family last week. She questioned them for almost 20 minutes over nothing." The supervisor's breathing turned shallow, panic taking over. "You are all twisting this. I follow protocol. I was trying to protect this terminal." Richard replied. "You were protecting your assumptions." He stepped closer, his presence a quiet force that made the supervisor shrink back. "You saw a 74-year-old black woman traveling alone, and instead of thinking traveler, you thought threat. You thought you could intimidate her, isolate her, and no one would speak up. But not today." Evelyn opened her eyes and looked directly at the supervisor for the first time since the encounter began. "I have lived through a world that told me I did not belong, but I never expected to relive it at an airport in my own country." Her voice did not rise. It did not need to. The truth in it was enough to quiet the entire terminal. Richard placed a steady hand on his mother's shoulder. "This is no longer an internal issue. I am filing a federal complaint, and I will testify in person." The supervisor staggered back as if she had been struck. "Ambassador, please, I am begging you. This cannot happen. My career, your career," Richard said, "was never supposed to be built on fear and prejudice." The administrator looked up from the tablet. "Ambassador, Oversight has already requested a live summary. They want your statement." Richard nodded. "They will get it." And as the suspended supervisor stood surrounded by witnesses, evidence, and the sound of her own misconduct replaying on the checkpoint screens, the collapse that had started minutes ago spread fully beneath her feet. There was no authority left to hold on to, only the consequences she had created. The administrator lifted the tablet to his chest, shoulders tightening as the live oversight channel connected. A faint chime echoed through the checkpoint, and every person within earshot seemed to recognize that something irreversible was about to happen. The suspended supervisor instinctively stepped back, as if distance alone could protect her from what she had set in motion. Ambassador Hale stood centered in the space, the authority in his posture unmistakable, not dramatic but absolute. He did not raise his voice. He never needed to. "This is Ambassador Richard Hale," he said, addressing the unseen federal audience now listening. "I am reporting an incident of racial profiling, unlawful detainment, and procedural misconduct at Checkpoint C of the International Terminal. The victim is my mother, Evelyn Brooks." A murmur spread through the gathered passengers. Until that moment, many had not realized the report was happening live. The supervisor's breathing quickened. "Ambassador, please, this is unnecessary," she whispered, barely able to push out the words. "You are destroying my career over a misunderstanding." Richard turned toward her, and every passenger leaned forward as if his next words were a verdict. "Misunderstandings happen when information is unclear," he said. "What happened here today was very clear." He gestured toward the replay on the screen, which showed her grabbing the passport, diminishing Evelyn, dismissing the scan, and issuing the override. This was not confusion. This was misconduct. The administrator confirmed, speaking for the first time into the oversight channel. All evidence supports the ambassador's statement. Multiple violations occurred, including an unauthorized override of a verified document and the use of inflammatory language toward the passenger. Maya stepped forward, summoning courage that trembled through her hands. "I witnessed everything," she said. She ignored the system, she ignored the truth, and she ignored the humanity in front of her. This was not a mistake. Passengers behind her nodded, voices overlapping. "I saw it too." She never let the woman speak. She assumed guilt before checking anything. Richard waited for the voices to settle before continuing. "My mother complied with every order. She stood still. She answered respectfully. She offered her passport. And in return, she was treated as a threat. Not because of her actions, but because of an assumption you carried into your role." He let the silence breathe. That silence was the cut. Then came the drop. "You looked at my mother and decided she did not belong in the line she paid for, in the country she helped raise me to serve, or in the dignity she earned over 74 years of life." Evelyn's eyes glistened, but she stood steady, no longer trembling, supported not only by her son but by the room that had witnessed the truth. The suspended supervisor shook her head, panic now cracking through every word. "Ambassador Hale, I was following protocol. If I had known who she was," Richard's voice sharpened, the calm edge of a blade. "Protocol is not determined by a traveler's title. Protocol is determined by behavior and system verification, neither of which she violated." He took one step closer, forcing the supervisor to meet the truth in his eyes. "And you should not have needed to know who she was to treat her with dignity." The administrator looked up from the tablet. "Oversight has confirmed they are taking jurisdiction. They have requested your final statement for the record, Ambassador." Richard nodded once. "Then let this statement be clear." He turned slightly, so that both the camera and the passengers heard every syllable. "My mother was profiled. She was wrongfully detained. And she was spoken to with contempt. Not because she broke a law, not because she failed a scan, but because someone in power decided she did not fit their idea of who belongs." He glanced at Evelyn, then back to the tablet. "I will pursue this to its full legal extent." The supervisor's shoulders collapsed. Her voice cracked as she whispered, "Please, I am begging you. I have worked here for 12 years. And then Richard delivered the sentence that would echo across the terminal. 12 years in a job means nothing if you spent them practicing disrespect. A hush fell over the crowd. Evelyn lifted her eyes toward her son, a quiet mixture of pride and sorrow. It was not triumph she felt. It was truth finally spoken aloud. The administrator confirmed, "Supervisor's credentials have been revoked. She is barred from further access. Oversight will proceed with disciplinary action." For the first time, the suspended supervisor seemed to understand that the collapse was complete. There was no policy left to hide behind, no badge to shield her, no authority to wield. Only accountability. For a moment, the suspended supervisor looked as if she might still argue, as if some hidden rulebook or forgotten clause could rescue her from the truth, now closing in from every direction. But there was nothing left to grab onto. Her badge was gone. The oversight channel had logged her misconduct. Witnesses stood ready to testify, and the very people she had expected to command were watching her crumble. She opened her mouth, but no words formed. Even her breath seemed to falter. The administrator lowered the tablet slowly, then turned toward 2 additional security managers who had arrived in response to the escalating report. "Per federal instruction," he said carefully, "the suspended supervisor is to be escorted out of the terminal pending investigation." The supervisor's eyes widened in horror. "You cannot escort me out in front of everyone," she whispered, her voice a tight thread fraying at the edges. Richard answered her without raising his volume. "It is the same walk you expected my mother to take. The only difference is you will not be treated like a threat." The crowd murmured in agreement. One of the managers stepped forward. "Ma'am, please gather your belongings." She shook her head violently. "No, not like this. I did nothing wrong. They are twisting my actions." Maya stepped closer, her voice firm now, steadier than before. "The recording twisted nothing. You did what you did." Several passengers nodded, creating a quiet, undeniable affirmation. The suspended supervisor looked around desperately, but there was no sympathy to be found. The authority she once wielded so sharply had evaporated, leaving a shell of someone who had relied on power rather than integrity. The managers gently guided her toward the service passage beside the checkpoint. The walk felt endless. Her footsteps were loud, even though she tried to take them softly. The passengers watched, many with solemn expressions, others with quiet relief. Her departure did not spark applause. Instead, it felt like the releasing of a breath that had been held too long. Evelyn watched calmly, not vindictive, not triumphant, simply present as the consequences unfolded. She had weathered a lifetime of similar moments without anyone standing beside her. Today was different. When the supervisor finally disappeared into the side corridor, the administrator returned to the ambassador and lowered his voice out of respect. "Ambassador Hale, we are deeply sorry. This should never have happened. You have our full cooperation going forward." Richard nodded once. "The apology belongs to my mother." The administrator turned immediately to Evelyn. "Mrs. Brooks, please accept our sincerest apologies for the treatment you received. We will initiate mandatory retraining across the terminal. We will issue a statement to all staff before the afternoon rotation. What happened here will not be ignored." Evelyn offered a small, tired smile. "I have heard promises like that before," she said quietly. "But this time," Maya added from behind them, "it will be on record." Richard looked at Maya with approval. "You are brave for speaking up," he said. "Do not lose that." Maya's eyes shimmered, pride mixing with relief. She had always wanted to be the kind of employee who stood for what was right. Today she proved she could be. Officer Daniels stepped forward as well, voice low and remorseful. "Mrs. Brooks, I am sorry for putting my hands on you. I should have questioned the order. I should have listened." Evelyn studied him for a moment. She did not excuse him, but she acknowledged the courage it took to admit wrongdoing. "Learn from this," she said softly. "Do not be the man who follows bad orders. Be the man who stops them." He nodded, humbled. The administrator cleared his throat. "Ambassador Hale, if you and your mother are ready, we would like to offer a private escort through security and directly to your gate. No additional screening will be required." Richard looked at Evelyn, giving her the choice. For the first time since the ordeal began, she stood a little taller. "I would like to walk," she said, "through the same line I chose before." Her son nodded. "Then we will walk." And as they stepped forward, the passengers instinctively parted, forming a clear path through the checkpoint. Not out of obligation, out of respect. Some placed hands over their hearts. Others whispered quiet apologies. One elderly woman mouthed, "You deserve better." Evelyn did not rush. She walked with the steady dignity she had been denied moments earlier, her son beside her and the weight of justice settling behind her. It was not triumph she felt. It was restoration, and it was long overdue. The walk through the checkpoint felt different now. Every step carried the echo of what had been taken from Evelyn and what had just been restored. The passengers who stood aside did not move out of fear or inconvenience. They stepped back with intention, offering space the same way people lift candles in a vigil. Evelyn passed through the metal detector with her shoulders squared, her chin lifted, her presence steady, reclaiming a dignity that never should have been challenged. When she emerged on the other side, Richard was waiting, his expression softening as if the ordeal had finally loosened its grip. An airport manager approached cautiously, holding a folder and a trembling apology. "Mrs. Brooks, Ambassador Hale, we will personally escort you to your gate. In addition, the airport director has authorized a written apology and a full internal review. This will not be buried." Evelyn accepted the gesture politely, but her eyes carried a depth that no apology could fully reach. She had lived through eras that disguised discrimination under different names, and she knew what it felt like to be dismissed by systems designed to protect only some. But today, she had witnesses. Today, she had proof. As they walked toward the concourse, the same passengers who had watched her humiliation now watched her restoration. A man in a denim jacket called out softly, "Safe travels, ma'am." A woman near a seating area added, "Thank you for standing up for all of us." Evelyn paused, touched by the unexpected solidarity. "I just wanted to get to my flight," she replied gently. "But sometimes life asks you to stand still long enough for the truth to be seen." Richard placed a hand on her back, guiding her forward. "Mom, you should not have had to endure that today." Evelyn shook her head. "I should not have had to endure it many days. But this one," she said, glancing back at the checkpoint where officers whispered urgently and managers typed furiously. This one might change something. They continued through the terminal until they reached a quieter gate area. A row of seats was cleared for them. A staff member brought water. Another brought a small card of travel necessities. The gesture was kind, but Evelyn gently waved off the fuss. "Please," she said, "treat every traveler this way, not just the ones with powerful children." The staff member nodded, swallowing hard. "We will remember that, ma'am." While they waited for boarding to begin, Richard checked his messages. Oversight had already issued a formal acknowledgement. The security company had initiated a mandatory training review, and a federal investigator had requested a recorded statement from both him and his mother upon her return. "This will be handled," he said quietly. "Not merely documented, but handled." Evelyn touched his hand. "Do not let this take too much of you. You have enough on your shoulders." Richard looked at her, not as an ambassador, but as a son who still saw the woman who raised him to stand tall. "You carried me through storms," he said. "The least I can do is shield you from one." A boarding agent approached. "Mrs. Brooks, Ambassador Hale, we are ready for you." Evelyn rose with a calm grace. She walked toward the jet bridge, but just before stepping inside, she turned back one last time. The terminal was quieter now. The checkpoint where she had been accused stood in the distance like a stage after the curtain had fallen, the audience long gone, but the truth etched into the air. She spoke softly, more to the moment than to anyone in particular. "Dignity should not depend on who you know," she said. "It should depend on who you are." And with that, she stepped onto the jet bridge. The door closed behind her, marking not just the start of her journey, but the beginning of an inquiry that would ripple far beyond one airport terminal. For everyone who had ever been underestimated, dismissed, or profiled, today was a reminder. Silence is not the price of survival, and justice does not always roar. Sometimes, it simply walks beside you, steady and unshaken, refusing to look away.